couple of announcements to begin with. First of all, I have office hours today rescheduled, not from 3:30 to 5:30, but 2 to 3. I'm sorry, I have something else that's come up this afternoon that I have to deal with. So if any of you want to come talk to me, do it then. And the other announcement is to say that we're going to give the midterms back in next Tuesday's lecture. So you won't be getting them in section on Friday or Monday, because we want you to carry on the important discussion work that you're doing in those sections, and you will have a chance to talk with me about your midterms if issues arise, and more of that later. Okay, so today represents the beginning of the rest of the class, a rendition over the next 100 years, up to the present day, from the aftermath of the First World War. And the next couple of lectures are both going to be exploring the legacies of the First World War, and to try and look at the types of change it generates. And you remember in that last lecture I was talking about whether the First World War can be understood as a cause of change or a catalyst of change, or as representing simply business as normal or continuity. The big issue that we're going to see and explore in these next couple of lectures is whether the First World War represented a caused a return back to the liberalism that had emerged in the 19th century, and particularly around questions of the liberal political economy, of the free trade, of the gold standard, of cheap government, of a belief in industrial progress and imperial expansion, or a move away from those things to something that looks very different in terms of a planned version of economy and society, something that would begin to gesture to a new type of system and reflected a new type of social contract between the state and its subjects. But today I'm going to basically focus on the political and cultural consequences of the war, and then on Thursday we'll explore in more detail the economic effects of the war. I want to start by reminding you of what a cataclysmic event the Great War was. In many ways, the First World War represented for contemporaries a type of test case of the nature of the modern world. Very similarly to the way in which the Second World War, and particularly the discovery and experience of the Holocaust, represented a type of test case of the nature of the modern world for people living in the 1940s and 1950s, and for the decades that followed it. The fear was that liberal progress had been decisively checked by the First World War, that the scale of industrial war had brutalized the population, that the global economy that had been constructed in the late 19th century had been decisively fractured, and that soldiers that had now become soldier citizens in Britain would demand a new set of social and political rights. Indeed, there was a great deal of fear in Britain of what the new democracy that was ushered in by the representation of the People's Act in 1918 would bring, particularly in the context of the Russian Revolution having unfolded in 1917. And as you're going to see today, the widespread amount of unrest that was generated in the aftermath of the war across the British Empire. Indeed, in many ways, 1919 represented a real moment of imperial crisis for Britain. Revolts and revolutions and anti-colonial protests spread across the British Empire after demobilization. And you're going to see that in Ireland, in India, in Iraq, in Egypt, in Afghanistan, in the Caribbean, in Somaliland, and and in Britain itself. Indeed, that tide of unrest in Britain culminates really with the outbreak of Britain's first ever and last ever general strike in 1926. There were two responses to this sense of impending crisis that the war had brought. The first was towards an idea that this chaos had to be met by a new type of science of government, a new interest in the art of government being about planning economic and social progress. That economic and social progress could no longer be left simply to the idea of the free market. The other was an attempt to reimagine Britain as it ideally was, as a rural place of stability and of consensus. And many historians have argued that the 1920s and the 1930s in Britain experienced something that they've described as an introspective turn, a turn away from the old 19th century imperial rhetoric of masculine expansion towards something that looked far more domesticated and orientated around what was considered to be a feminine experience. So I'm going to talk about how this introspective turn happens by looking at the remaking of relations in the home, by the growing fascination with the countryside, with the political settlement through Stanley Baldwin's Conservative Party, and finally through the Empire. Let me turn first to this remaking of domestic and gender relations. And the first thing I want to talk about in this context is the development of what is often referred to as a new wave of feminism. Okay, remember that in 1918, the women's suffrage movement had accepted a great compromise. It had accepted the compromise that only some women would get the vote, and that propertied women and women over 30 had the vote. But that left many unenfranchised. And indeed, much of the activities of the suffrage movement after 1918 was focused around a different set of demands. Now, the new umbrella organization that women organized around was this was the National Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship. And they basically outlined 6 principal demands. They wanted equal pay for equal work, and that, of course, meant opening up women's work in industry and the professions, which had been obviously a long-standing part of the women's movement since the 1850s. They demanded an equal standard of sex morals between men and women. Remember that moral critique of a rampant male sexuality had been very important to the women's suffrage movement before the war. And that represented, in particular, an attention to divorce laws and the reform of divorce laws so that adultery by husbands would count, and there would be new laws against solicitation and prostitution. They also demanded the introduction of legislation to provide pensions for civilian widows and dependent children. Remember that much of the system of national insurance that had been set up in 1911 was structured around the adult male worker. They also demanded the equalization of the franchise, that is the enfranchisement of all women, and demanded that there should be more women candidates able to stand for Parliament. They wanted equal legal recognition of mothers as guardians of their children, so that it wasn't simply fathers who were considered guardians, and they wanted the opening of the legal profession to women, particularly the institution of the magistracy, or JPs. So in many ways you can see this set of arguments about the consolidation of further demands for the equality of women. But it's also true that feminists began to argue increasingly, and this again was a development from the Edwardian period, for the different experiences and different requirements of women. Women who now started to agitate for things like birth control, for clinics for child welfare, and for family allowances. Indeed, one of the lead spokesmen of this movement, Eleanor Rathbone, that you see talking here at a meeting, was one of the people who argued very forcibly that the family allowance should be rewarded to women as a payment for their domestic labour. That women who worked unwaged at home deserved compensation for their labour. They also engaged, and Rathbone again was very involved here, in campaigns across the British Empire against child marriage, particularly in India, and female circumcision. Okay? Again, this is a continuation of the tradition of imperial social reform that Josephine Butler had started in the late 19th century. One of the lead figures in the interest in birth control was a character known as Mary Stopes. Now, Mary Stopes became best known for this publication, Married Love, in 1918, which was hugely successful, translated into 10 languages by 1931, and selling around 400,000 copies. What was really important about Stopes's work was that she argued that marriage and sexual relations in marriage should be a reciprocal relationship. That marriage should represent a physical and spiritual union, where men and women met on equal terms. And for Stopes, that in many ways was best symbolized by the idea of the mutual orgasm. This perfect union for Stopes should be also about the sexual fulfillment of women. Women should no longer have to lie back and think of England and endure the turmoil and misery of sexual intercourse, but they should be pleasured by their partners. A radically new concept, given the importance of the idea of the wife as a servant of her husband. Neither was she alone in this type of argument. There were many guides by to sexual relations for married couples. Another example I show you here was Van der Velde's Ideal Marriage, published in 1926, and his Threshold of Marriage, published in 1932, both of which sold actually more copies than Mary Stopes, and were basically sex manuals for married couples. Again, not something that you would have been imaginable before the war. Not something, for instance, that you could imagine Mrs. Beeton having a chapter on in her publication. Indeed, the question of sexual relations between men and women also found a new platform in the emergence of a new trend, which was the emergence of agony aunts and lonely hearts columns. People writing in popular magazines, giving advice on the conduct of marriage and romantic relations and sexual relations, and most interestingly of all, I think, the Lonely Hearts column. Now, there had been adverts in the marriage market of people trying to attract brides or husbands, But the Lonely Hearts columns really blossomed in the era after the Great War, many of which was about trying to address this question of the so-called 1 million surplus women that had been left over by the casualties of men during the war. So, for instance, one ad in 1916 by a serviceman returning on leave generated 3,000 letters and 98 parcels from interested ladies. There was something like 30,000 Lonely Hearts ads published immediately in the year immediately after the war. And these Lonely Hearts columns were often articulated in the language of euphemism, that people were looking for pen pals, they were bohemian or they were sporty. They used a whole range of different words to try and convey the type of partner that they were interested in acquiring. This went hand in hand, I think, with the redefinition of the domestic space and family relations. In many ways, historians often note that after wars, especially after wars in the 20th century when women have played an unprecedented role in the workforce, there are often attempts to try and reinscribe forms of sexual difference that try and get women back into the domestic environment. It happens both after the First World War and the Second World War. One of the new features of the attempt to reconfine women to the domestic sphere was the idea that domestic work had now required a new set of professional skills, that domestic work was itself a type of science that women had to master in order to do that work efficiently. And you can see here there's a proliferation of women's magazines, from Good Housekeeping, first published in 1922, which was my mother's favourite magazine all the way down through the 1980s, and a whole series of others which I won't bother to read out because you can see them behind me. Women's domestic work was also made very different by the fact that the family was taking a new type of shape in the decades after the war. It's really in this period that you see the emergence of the nuclear family around 2.5 children. And that was due to the declining birth rate across all classes. So in 1914, there had been 23.9 births per thousand people. By 1945, that had fallen to 16.2. So women were now masters of their own domestic domain and masters of their children in a very different type of way than in the Victorian period. And the fact that homemaking and, if you like, family government became professionalized was also represented in the development of domestic science or household management as an academic pursuit. So King's College in London had set up in 1915 its own program in what it described as household and social science. The idea that domestic science was part of the broader social sciences. By 1930, there were something like 3,000 specialist teachers in elementary schools teaching domestic subjects to around 500,000 girls. So it wasn't just the elite areas of academic life, women going to college in the 1920s and 1930s, which were obviously in small numbers. This was also diffused through the elementary system. And many of the women trained in places like King's College London went on to go and work across the British Empire in a various numbers of development programs concerned with teaching indigenous people how to cook and how to keep clean houses and sanitary houses, etc. You can see here a kitchen from the King's College campus designed to be able to model how this new domestic science was to be practiced. Okay, so importantly, relations between men and women were changed, and women's roles in particular changed around these domestic spaces. One of the key elements of that was the idea that men and women had to overcome the sex war that had been seen to be so rampantly out of control before the Great War. There was a sense that men and women had to come together in new types of ways. And all of those things that I've spoken to you about were part of that process. Let me talk now about the growing fascination with the countryside as a site of stability and tranquility. In 1926, H.V. Morton published this book, In Search of England, in which he described his quest around the country for, in a like, the essential rural England of village greens and parish churches and a sedate way of life. What's interesting about this book, apart from this idea that tranquility rested in the countryside, and the countryside was the place where men and women shattered by the experience of war could restore themselves, was the fact that Morton described his journey around England by motor car. Cars were a new bourgeois phenomenon between the wars. There had only been 132,000 motor cars in 1914. By 1938, there were around 2 million. The British version of AAA, the AA, the Automobile Association, had been founded in 1905, and it increasingly published large numbers of touring routes, giving motorists guides to how they can experience the countryside upon what the quality of the roads, etc., etc. Now, I want you to be very clear that Britons aren't nearly as advanced in car ownership as the United States. It has the equivalent of the Ford's Model T was the Austin 7, this humble but very effective car that my uncle was a fanatic collector of. I mean, he didn't have more than one, but, you know, he cycled through several. And you can see that one of the key things about car ownership is that it was predominantly focused in the southwest. And that the further north that you get, the less car ownership there is. And as you'll see on Thursday, this really reflected the geographical distribution of wealth in Britain between the wars, where the southern half of the country was basically in a type of little boom, and the north continued to experience considerable hardship and poverty. Indeed, car ownership began to become an important part of the development of new suburban estates. But there are really two components to the growth of suburbia in interwar Britain. And the car really plays very little role in the first of these, which was the growth of public home ownership, what in Britain is known as council houses, and in America as projects, housing projects. The British public had been promised homes fit for heroes after the First World War by King George himself. It was widely recognized that men returning from the front wanted to return to a better Britain. And a better Britain for many people was symbolized by the quality of housing and the need to tear down slum dwellings of the 19th century cities and replace them with proper public housing and affordable public housing. This was basically written up in this official government report, the Tudor-Walters report, in 1918, which recommended the expansion of public housing. And indeed, the Addison Act of 1919 provided the legislative mechanism for the growth of public housing. And between 1919 and 1939, some 750,000 council houses were built. And the vast majority of those were built in the immediate years after the war, between 1919 and 1922. You can get a sense of the nature of these houses by a wonderful book produced by the documentary photographer Bill Brandt called Homes Fit for Heroes, published in 1944, which was, of course was published at the end of the Second World War to highlight how inadequate public housing, the construction of public housing, had been after the First World War. And this was part of the agenda to try and to make public housing even better after the Second World War. They were simple, sturdy affairs. The other element of the growth of suburban Britain came from private construction and private ownership. And this really predominated from the middle of the 1920s through to the end of the 1930s. 4 million private houses were built between 1914 and 1938, and the really significant figure here is that home ownership, or the percentage of owner-occupiers of the housing stock, increased from 10 to 32% in this period of time. So just 10% of Britons owned their own homes in 1914. But that rises significantly to 32% and actually stays around there until remarkably late in the 20th century, as we'll hear in future lectures. This growth of the private housing market really created a new type of property market. So the type of real estate practices that become very familiar to Britons in the second half of the 20th century were really invented in the period from the 1920s and 1930s. One of the key events that dramatized the attraction of home ownership and of suburban life was the Daily Mail's Ideal Home exhibition, which had started in 1908 and ran for the next 7 decades. In fact, as far as I know, it may even still be running today. What the Ideal Homes exhibition did was basically model the new type of life that married couples could experience in suburbia. So my wife's paternal grandparents, got that right, my wife's paternal grandfather returned from India in the First World War, and they went to the Ideal Homes exhibition in the early 1920s and bought what in America would be known as a tract house, a development very near Slough, where the office was set, and it was a bungalow, a very modern bungalow, a bungalow that my wife's paternal grandfather was very attracted to because he had experienced living in bungalows in India for the first time, and this was part of a broader suburban development. And there they could indulge in things like gardening and DIY and listening to the wireless. These were all considered the new type of quiet domestic pleasures of family life that began to emerge in the 1920s and 1930s. So some images to make this come alive a little. on your left, you have sorry, I should just say, the main companies involved in the construction of these sites, many of which were built actually by small-time builders who would just build one or two houses. But there were also these big companies, Costain, Wimpey, and Ideal Homestead, building much larger developments. And here you can see a brochure from Ideal Homesteads for one of their model houses. And here you see one of the larger suburban estates in Lewisham in South London. A couple of other images just to bring home how important this is. This is a slightly complicated graph, but it's basically number of new dwellings built per year per 1,000 people. What I want you to grasp is that this period from 1918 up to 1939 is a period of massive development of Britain's housing stock. Indeed, it's matched in the period after the Second World War for longer, but much of Britain's housing stock continues to have been built at this time. If you drive anywhere around Britain, you will come across these homes built in the 1920s and 1930s. The other graph I have here is basically showing you the distinction between public housing that you can see here, down here, and then the uptake of private housing in the years from 1925. Now, the problem with suburban development was, of course, that it was built on the countryside, and it was built in chaotic, unplanned types of ways. And so it is interestingly in the 1920s that you get the development of a rural preservation movement in Britain, trying to protect the countryside from the encroachment of these new unplanned suburban developments. And the key organisation here, still going strong, was the Council for the Protection of Rural England, which was responsible for the publication of this book, England and the Octopus of Development, which showed that something like 50,000 acres of British countryside was being lost every year. And to the preservationists, this represented a loss of the very fabric of the countryside that they thought was the spiritual essence of Britain and the place where Britons could recover from the turmoil of war. They just didn't want people actually living there. It was okay for people to visit, but it wasn't okay for them to live in what they considered ugly suburban developments. But the countryside wasn't just about suburban development. It was also about popular pastimes. And those people who couldn't afford to buy the new suburban houses, or who weren't living in the new public housing estates on the fringes of cities, began to go out to the countryside to ramble many weekends. Rambling in Britain is basically the equivalent of hiking in the United States. The Youth Hostel Association, formed in 1930, was a key part of this explosion of interest in discovering and encountering the countryside by working people. It had 300 hostels by 1939 and 83,000 members. It provided cheap accommodation, cheap communal accommodation very often, for people who could not afford to either stay in bed and breakfasts or in hotels. And indeed, the bed and breakfast industry began to develop in this period. It was at this point that people began to take in strangers into their houses to make money, not least because, as we'll see on Thursday, the countryside was considering agriculture was in a very bad way at all. So many people who lived in the countryside needed alternative forms of income. Now, the problem was that even though was that land ownership, as you'll remember from the 19th century, continued to be dominated by a very remarkably few number of aristocratic owners. And so people walking out in the countryside were often, despite the existence of public footpaths that often went back centuries, were often driven off the land by gamekeepers and wardens on aristocratic estates. So in 1932, Kinder Scout, which is this image that you see before you, and Kinder Scout is basically between Manchester and Sheffield in the Peak District. Indeed, I used to live pretty much just over this hill here. They organised a mass trespass in which hundreds of people broke across the fences and said, look, this land is unused and we are taking ownership of it. This land belongs to the people. It shouldn't be confined simply to the aristocracy wanting to shoot their grouse. This mass trespass becomes hugely important because it becomes one of the building blocks for the taking the development of public lands in Britain and the creation of the national park system in Britain after the Second World War. So the point that I'm trying to make here is working people also have this lust to be out in the countryside and to be able to recuperate and regenerate themselves after the war. Any questions on any of that stuff before I move into the second half of this lecture? Melody. Right. Council tax has basically always existed. That is to say that there's always been a local property tax that was known as rates. Okay, so whatever parish you lived in, or whatever municipal borough you lived in, you paid rates that supported what local government did. And that had existed pretty much time out of mind. I mean, certainly back into the 17th century and further back. The council tax that you're referring to, I think, was an invention that came in the early 1990s and was an attempt to try and reform local forms of taxation. But basically, much of the construction of public housing came out of local municipal funds that were supplemented by federal state funds. Okay? It was a sort of compact between the central state and local taxation. Okay, so let me move into the politics of this so-called introspective term. You can see that part of what I'm trying to say here, or part of what it is that several historians have argued about this period, is that there's a conservative turn, this introspective turn, this fascination with England and the countryside and remaking family and domestic relations was conservative with a small c. Okay? But it's also the case that the Conservative Party became the dominant force in Britain in the 1920s and the 1930s. And this was a pretty remarkable development, or a surprising development. No one expected that the point in which Britain would finally become a democratic state in 1918 and 1928, where still 70% of the population was working class, no one believed that that working class electorate would return conservative governments. Remember, the Conservative government Conservative Party throughout the 19th century had represented primarily the defence of aristocratic interests, even though in the 1870s it had embraced social reform at home, the protection of British jobs, and an aggressive imperial agenda to try and be attractive to working people. Nonetheless, everybody expected that when the working people got the vote, that they would vote for the Labour Party, which began to basically displace the Liberal Party as the principal party of opposition in the 1920s. Indeed, the Labour Party has its first administration in 1924. This was the way in which people expected political history to develop, that the Labour Party would now be in power ceaselessly because of the working class nature of the franchise. But that doesn't happen. Instead, the Conservative Party is basically hegemonic throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. How does this happen? Well, it happens by the Conservative Party very skillfully rebranding itself, reinventing itself around this key figure, Stanley Baldwin. Stanley Baldwin, who is Prime Minister between 1923 and 24, again at the end of 1924 through to 1929, again between 1935 and 1937, and is Deputy Prime Minister in a national government formed after the economic crisis of 1931 through to 1935. Stanley Baldwin is the dominant political figure of the 1920s and the 1930s. He is, if you like, the Gladstone of the early 20th century. And interestingly, what Baldwin does is try and adopt that Gladstonian mantle. That is to say, the Conservative Party that had argued against free trade, cheap government, well, that's a lie. It hadn't argued against cheap government, but that had begun to argue against free trade, and had argued against the expansion of the franchise, began to project itself as the party that would defend the constitutional rights of Britain and would become the fiscally responsible party. Remember, Gladstone's whole thing was about retrenchment, cheap government. Part of this was made possible, of course, by the dramatic costs of the First World War. Britain's national debt, which you remember had been huge at the end of the Napoleonic Wars and then had been gradually cut down to almost nothing by the beginning of the 20th century, mushroomed in the period during the war. It was a 706 million in 1914. It grew to 7.5 million in 1918. And indeed, it continued to grow throughout the interwar period for reasons I'll explain on Thursday. So the first thing that Baldwin and the Conservative Party did was to say we have to get control of the national debt. And so therefore, from 1922 to 1923, they begin a process of major retrenchment in government expenditure. In 1925, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, a person that you'll probably have heard of, Winston Churchill, also decides that Britain must return to the gold standard. Okay? Remember, the gold standard had been basically suspended at the outbreak of the First World War. It was believed by Churchill that restoring Britain to the gold standard would restore its pre-war eminence in global trade. But doing so was only possible thanks to American loans. A loan of $200 million from the US Federal Reserve and $100 million by the merchant bank JP Morgan. Churchill's big mistake, and there were several, but arguably his biggest mistake was to decide that Britain had to return to the gold standard at its pre-war levels, which was basically at almost $5 to the pound, even though the value of the pound had fallen as low as 3.4 in 1920. But symbolically, the return of Britain to the gold standard at its pre-war level was meant to restore the British economy to its previous height and dominance. Also, the Conservative Party continued just about to hold on to the belief of the free trade. There had been those in the Conservative Party that had argued for the importance of protection from Chamberlain on in the first decade of the 20th century, but Baldwin managed to keep them at bay. That the system of imperial tariffs and imperial protection that Chamberlain and his followers had argued for didn't come to fruition until 1931. So in many ways, the Conservative Party takes on the key elements of that the Liberal Party had been so insistent upon for much of the 19th century. The other thing that makes Baldwin highly effective as a winner of elections was his idea that he could restore stability, political stability, to Britain. And this in the context, basically, of the threat of Bolshevism. So the Russian Revolution in 1917 hung a big shadow after post-war British politics in Britain. Not that the influence of the Conservative Party the Communist Party was really of any importance until the end of the 1920s, 1930s. But in the conservative imagination, there were Reds under just about every bed. And so in 1924, the Daily Mail publishes this famous Zinoviev letter showing that the British Labour Party is under direct control from the Kremlin. This, of course, in the run-up to the election of 1924. During the general strike of 1926, which I'll explain to you on Thursday, Baldwin and Churchill are highly effective in mobilizing people against the industrial chaos that resulted. And they did so basically by arguing that people had to rally behind the defense of the Constitution, that the unions were holding the country to ransom, and that this was highly damaging, that it was the British government that should run the nation. And they rallied what they called the constitutional classes. That is to say, the people who weren't part of the organised labour movement. So people like my grandfather, you remember from the last lecture, who fought in the First World War, rallied in defence of the nation as a special constable. Many special constables were sworn in to supplement the ranks of the army on the streets. And here he gets his special letter from Stanley Baldwin thanking him for his service to the nation. So there is a major labour crisis and the threat of Bolshevism that Baldwin promises to hold at bay. But there are also a series of other crises that Baldwin is highly effective at being able to show himself to be the best manager of. So there's the enormous financial crisis in 1931, and then there is the abdication crisis in 1936, when the future of the British monarchy seems to be at risk because of the pernicious influence of an American divorcee. Those American women, really. Through all of this, Baldwin has this mantra of safety first, okay? That Britain has to stay safe, business as normal, and the Constitution and the economy must run in the same old ways. The last part of this jigsaw puzzle is the imperial picture. Now, if these conservatives are right, that there is a turn away from the old masculine, adventurous imperial rhetoric that had characterized the militarism of the late Victorian and Edwardian period, then you would expect to see the British Empire at taking a much less visible place in British politics and in the British imagination. In fact, the very opposite happens. In 1919, after the Treaty of Versailles, the British Empire is at the height of its strength and power. Measured in terms of its territory and population, it's the largest it will ever be. It covered 13 million square miles and included over 450 million people. And that expansion was due to the dark red areas on this map, here, here, and here, which was the mandate areas that were established by the Treaty of Versailles, where basically Britain and France divided up the former imperial territories of the Ottoman Empire and the German Empire. So Britain has mandate territories in the Middle East, in Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq, and in Africa, in East Africa, in Tanganyika, here, in the British Cameroons, and in Togoland as well. In fact, the Cameroons and the Togoland were split between the British, and there was a French Cameroons and French Togoland as well. So certainly in terms of territory, the British Empire is in very good shape in 1919. But everything was not rosy in the British imperial garden by any way. The First World War had been an imperial war. That is to say, it had been fought by imperial troops. Remember, something like 250,000 colonial troops died in the service of defending the British Empire during the First World War. And for many colonial people, this service, this defense of the motherland in the First World War, provided one important claim to independence or to new forms of political recognition within the British Empire. They had done their imperial duty. They now expected a certain flow of rights to come, just as the British people had themselves received the vote as reward for their efforts during the Great War. Indeed, you see here a picture of a Caribbean regiment in France. But that doesn't happen, or it happens very falteringly. And in 1919, there are a series of revolts and revolutions across the British Empire. In Iraq, in Egypt, Ireland, India, Afghanistan, and Somaliland, and a whole series of very important strikes across the Caribbean. Many of these were emboldened by the Wilsonian rhetoric of self-determination in the run-up to Versailles. Many of them were, of course, abandoned by that very same rhetoric. That is to say, self-determination for Wilson was something that was, shall we say, unevenly applied. So colonial subjects receive a type of double whammy after the First World War. They think they've done their duty, so they should get some basic rights in return from the British. They think that Wilson is going to offer a new model of international self-determination, and it doesn't happen. So the British Empire returns to its tried and tested techniques of imperial governance, a splash of reform, and a good dose of repression to keep everything in order. Let me talk first about the repression. And I'll do this. I can't cover everywhere, so I'm just going to talk about Ireland, India, and Iraq. In Ireland, after the Rising in 1916, the first election to the Irish Parliament came in 1918. And there, Sinn Féin, which was campaigning for the declaration of an Irish Republic, won the majority of seats at that election, 73 out of 105 seats. You know, a dominant victory. And Sinn Féin declared a republic. At that same time, there starts basically a type of colonial war in which Irish volunteers or the Irish Republican Army, the military wing of Sinn Féin, start attacks on the Royal Irish Constabulary, the Anglo-Irish police force. The British government obviously refuses to recognise the Republic declared by Sinn Féin and brings in its own military units known as the Black and Tans, many of whom were recruited as veterans from the First World War, to join the Royal Irish Constabulary to quell the revolt in Ireland. There followed 2 very bloody years of war between 1919 and 1921. In India, the dynamic is not that dissimilar. But the main example of colonial violence came, of course, at the massacre at Amritsar. Amritsar was the site of a famous Punjabi festival, and there had been the declaration of martial law in India to quell the growing nationalist meetings that had gathered steam in 1919. And the local military commander, General Reginald Dyer, insisted on using the full force of martial law by declaring the gathering at this festival to be illegal and declaring it to be organised by the Indian National Congress. Over 1,000 people were killed, many women and children, shot by machine guns in a walled space where all the exits were blocked. The official figure was 300 dead. But over 1,500 rounds of ammunition were fired at the crowd for 10 minutes. It was unusually such a scale of violence that it was condemned across the political spectrum. Winston Churchill was one of those who thought it was a barbaric episode. The Labour Party were obviously fierce in their denunciations. But Dyer found much support in Britain. Not least through a newspaper known as the Morning Post that collected £26,000 to its subscription fund to provide Dyer in his retirement because he was court-martialed and stripped of his duties. It was this, if you follow the news, it was Amritsar that the current Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, went and visited a couple of weeks ago and did or did not, no one's quite sure of whether he apologised or not. The last place I want to talk about is Iraq. You'll remember that the Air Force had begun to play a very small role in the Great War. and much of the place where the Air Force was most successful was on large territories, obviously away from the big infantry guns. In the 1920s, Britain decided that air control was going to be a very effective way of policing its new imperial territories in the Middle East and in East Africa. Air control seemed to be ideally suited for a low-cost empire, where you could use air control to cover a lot of ground very quickly without having to have people or military posts on the spot. And in Iraq in 1920 to 1921, Winston Churchill, who's coming up a lot today, who was then colonial secretary, developed the idea of air control with, interestingly, one of the great heroes of the Mesopotamia campaign of the First World War, T.E. Lawrence. They wanted to use the aerial bombardment on civilians and nomadic groups to have a moral effect on the population. The idea was not just the speed of transmission and the cost effectiveness of air control, but the idea that aerial bombardment would have a moral effect, a pacifying effect on the population. It would demonstrate the omnipotent power of British colonial rule. And surprise, surprise, it was in Iraq that someone who will become infamous in the Second World War, Arthur Bomber Harris, developed the idea of saturation aerial bombardment, a lesson that, of course, would be taken to the continent of Europe during the Second World War. So that's the story of repression. And that repression was counterbalanced by attempts at reform that were always compromises and that in many ways energized as much as satiated the demands of nationalists. So the first set of reforms came in India with the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms that expanded the representative mechanisms to allow Indians to vote in local elections for provincial governments, or some Indians to vote for provincial governments. In Ireland, at the end of the war, of course, there was the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty that established the creation of the Irish Free State, but, of course, didn't allow didn't allow the Republic at all. That Ireland continued, even though it was called a Free State, to be part of the British Empire, and that, of course, created a civil war for the next decade between those who defended the treaty and those who did not. And finally, in 1922, following basically 3 years of martial law in Egypt, there was formal recognition of Egyptian independence in 1922. In 1924, the idea was to hold a grand imperial conference at Wembley in London. Indeed, Wembley Stadium, where the finest of all rubbish national soccer teams, England, plays, was built as part of this imperial conference. The idea was that the imperial conference would show that the empire had weathered the storm and that there was a new unity amongst increasingly independent nations. And finally, in 1931, the Statute of Westminster is passed, in which the dominions were finally released of the legal requirement to acknowledge legislation passed in the mother of all parliaments in Westminster. It's only in 1931 that Westminster legislation is no longer overrides that done in the parliaments of dominions in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Okay, any questions before I wrap up? So the Irish Republican movement basically fractured over between those who accepted the treaty as the best possible deal that that Republicans could get, and a modicum of self-rule, well, not a modicum, an idea of self-rule, of home rule, and those who thought that the declaration of a republic, completely independent of Britain, was a compromise that, you know, they were not prepared to compromise on that. And so that's the conflict between those who accepted the treaty and those who didn't. Those who believed that independence would only come with a declaration of a republic, and those who were prepared to accept a sort of halfway house. And there was literally a military conflict between the new Irish government and the Republicans who continued to refuse to accept the legitimacy of the Free State. And that went on for up through the 1930s. Anything else? Yeah. Wembley, the stadium at Wembley, which has been so stunningly redesigned in the last decade, was built in 1924 for this conference. And I'm not sure that you can see this, but here's a sort of, there it is, there's Wembley Stadium. Oh, 3 lines on my chest. Can hear my heart beating at the very thought of it. There I am running out onto the pitch and, oh, I've just scored the winning goal. No, sorry, I'm digressing. You can, this is basically the outline of the whole Wembley exhibition. But obviously the centerpiece is this fabulous stadium, and my childhood dreams of scoring a winning goal there, or just actually just playing on it would be fine, or indeed just walking out on the pitch would be fine. But anyway, enough of my sad middle-aged fantasies. There's a lot more where that came from. It's a very dangerous, slippery slope for me to get started on that. So let me conclude, so you'll get out before you become my therapist. So the basic point that I've been trying to talk about today is the sort of cultural and political rehabilitation of Britain after the Great War. And the way in which many people, whether it was in terms of the domestic environment and the relationship between the sexes, whether it was about discovering the tranquility and the peace of the countryside, the idea that only the countryside, not industrial urban Britain, that had seemed to produce the carnage of the First World War, but something else as the basis of a new order, and those that embraced the idea of political stability in the political turmoil of the 1920s. I've obviously been trying to suggest, not least through the example of the Empire, that this was very much a fragile exercise. Okay? Amidst all of this attempt to restore and create stability in Britain, there was an endless series of wars across the British Empire. There was the general strike. There was a good deal of industrial unease. But the bottom line is, basically, that you do have something that looks very different for significant sections of the population. I don't want to argue that in the 1920s and the 1930s you get a new type of bourgeois conservative modernity associated with suburban life. That is to say, it's the new bourgeoisie who buy their own houses in suburbia, who embrace the Conservative Party and focus on growing their roses, not on reading about the latest imperial adventure. Okay. Because this was a broader affair than simply the new suburban bourgeoisie. Many working people also believed in this need to restore stability and tranquility. It wasn't simply something that was the property of any one class. The Great War had been a psychically very tumultuous experience for many Britons, and many people felt the need to try and re-establish forms of cultural and social stability in its aftermath. It was just, as we will see on Thursday, incredibly difficult for many sections of the population to be able to do that. Okay. So I'll see you on Thursday, and you'll hear all about the wonders of the interwar economy.